De Agri Cultura, one of the most evil books ever written. Most of us, when we think about evil books, don't picture farming manuals. We think of political manifestos, extremist screeds, maybe even dystopian fiction that inspired real-world cruelty. But today, I want to argue that one of the most evil books ever written is in fact a farming guide. It's called De Agricultura, on agriculture. Written around 160 BCE by Marcus Porcius Cato, better known as Cato the Elder. At first glance, it looks harmless advice on vineyards, olive groves and estate management, the kind of thing you might imagine tucked away in a Roman farmer's toolkit. But peel back the surface and you find something chilling. De Agricultura isn't really about farming, it's about exploitation. It's about maximizing profit by reducing human beings to tools. And when you reframe it through the lens of Roman politics, populists versus optimates, farmers versus plutocrats, you start to see just how corrosive this book was to the Republic. And here's the kicker: the heartlessness that Cato codified 2,000 years ago still echoes in our politics today. So let's dig in. To understand the horror of De Agricultura, you first have to understand what it replaced. In the early Republic, Rome worshipped the ideal of the citizen farmer. These were men who worked their own land, lived, and when duty called, served in the legions. They weren't professional soldiers. They weren't wealthy aristocrats. They were ordinary citizens rooted in the soil, who gave Rome both its food and its armies. This was the embodiment of mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. It meant discipline, modesty, civic duty, and self-reliance. Cicero, a century later, captured this ideal beautifully. He wrote, "Of all the occupations by which gain is secured, none is better than agriculture, none more profitable, none more delightful, none more worthy of a free man." In other words, farming wasn't just an economic activity. It was the moral bedrock of Roman life. The farmer was independent. He owed nothing to a master. He worked, he served, he voted, and in doing so, he embodied the Republic itself. That was the populist vision of Rome, dignity rooted in labour. Enter Cato the Elder. Cato loved to present himself as the voice of tradition. He railed against luxury, warned against foreign corruption, and praised the stern virtues of the past. If you stopped at his speeches, you'd think he was the ultimate defender of mos maiorum. But in De Agri Cultura, the mask slips. Instead of instructions for the independent farmer, Cato gives us a handbook for managing slave estates. He isn't talking to smallholders, he's talking to wealthy landowners running large plantations with armies of enslaved labourers. His tone is cold, managerial, utterly devoid of compassion. One of his most infamous instructions says, "Sell worn-out oxen, old tools, broken wagons, old slaves, sickly slaves, and anything else that is superfluous." Think about that. In the same breath, he equates sick human beings with broken tools and lame animals. They're all superfluous, all disposable. This isn't the voice of mos maiorum. This is the voice of ruthless efficiency, of the optimate elite who profit from conquest and care nothing for the citizens they displace. And here's the irony. Cato pretends to honour the farmer, but his book is an instruction manual for destroying him. This gets us to the core political battle of the Republic. Populares versus Optimates. Populares, the populists, tried to defend the dignity of ordinary citizens, especially farmers. They argued for land reform, grain subsidies, and limits on aristocratic greed. Optimates, the self-styled defenders of tradition, were actually the defenders of wealth and privilege. They cloaked their greed in the language of Roman virtue, while gutting the very class they claimed to protect. Cato is a perfect example of this contradiction. He praised the farmer in theory while writing a playbook for slave-based estates in practice. The populists saw what was happening. Tiberius Gracchus, trying to restore land to dispossessed farmers, famously said, "Wild beasts have their dens and lairs, but the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy nothing more than the air and light. They wander homeless with their wives and children." That is the reality Cato's book helped create. Citizens stripped of land, driven from the countryside, reduced to dependence on aristocratic estates or handouts in Rome. Cato's wisdom armed the Optimates with a justification for turning farming from a civic duty into a profit machine. Let's be clear about what this meant on the ground. After Rome's victories in the Punic Wars, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were dragged back to Italy. They became the workforce for massive estates, latifundia, owned by the wealthy elite. Meanwhile, soldiers returning from years abroad found their farms ruined or bought up. They couldn't compete with the cheap labor of slaves, so they sold out, moved to the city, and joined the swelling urban poor. Sallust, writing about this era, put it bluntly, "Greed destroyed honor, integrity, and all other noble qualities. In their place came cruelty, neglect of the gods, and a reckless disregard for everything." Cato's De Agri Cultura is not just a symptom of that greed. It's a codification of it. It takes human cruelty and writes it down as the proper way to run a household. It turns exploitation into common sense. That's why I don't just call it a farming manual. I call it one of the most evil books ever written. Now, some might object, but wasn't this just how things worked in Rome? Isn't it unfair to judge Cato by modern standards? Here's my answer. Evil isn't just about cruelty. It's about the normalization of cruelty. Cato didn't invent slavery, but he taught elites how to make it efficient, profitable, and impersonal. He stripped away any trace of moral unease and replaced it with cold arithmetic. Seneca, a century later, would write, "They are slaves, but they are also men." That simple acknowledgement of shared humanity is completely absent in Cato, and that's what makes De Agri Cultura so insidious. Because when cruelty is presented as wisdom, when dehumanization is presented as common sense, you end up reshaping an entire culture to accept heartlessness as the norm. Now let's leap forward 2 millennia. The struggle between populists and optimates, farmers and plutocrats, didn't end with Rome. It resurfaces again and again in history. And one of the clearest parallels is the United States in the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln's republicanism was built on the principle of free labor. He believed a man should rise by his own work, not be reduced to property. In one of his most famous lines, he said, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed." That is almost the exact opposite of Cato's logic. Lincoln argued that human dignity comes first, profit is secondary. Now compare that to the heirs of Cato today, what I'll call the Cato cows. These are the people who still put profit above humanity. They defend sweatshops. They defend economic systems that chew up workers and spit them out. They praise efficiency, while entire communities are hollowed out. They sound modern, but their moral logic is ancient. It's the same cold calculus that Cato wrote into De Agri Cultura. History shows us what happens when you follow Cato's path. The Gracchi brothers tried to restore land to Rome's farmers, and they were assassinated. Sallust warned that greed was destroying the Republic, and he was ignored. The Republic collapsed into civil wars, and the Optimates congratulated themselves all the way to the grave. In America, Lincoln warned that a house divided against itself cannot stand. He saw slavery as both a moral abomination and a threat to the Republic's survival. And for that vision, he too was assassinated. Both Rome and America faced the same choice: populist dignity versus optimate greed. And both show us how high the stakes really are. So let's come back to the central question. Was Cato one of the most evil men in history? On one level, he was just another Roman statesman, but because he wrote De Agri Cultura, because he codified the logic of turning people into tools, because he gave future elites a guidebook for normalizing cruelty, I'd argue yes, he deserves that label. Because books matter, ideas matter. And when you write a book that teaches people to sell sick human beings as if they were broken plows, you have crossed into a special category of evil. Rome lost its republic, America nearly lost its union. And today, we still risk repeating the same mistake whenever we put profit above people. If this video made you feel uncomfortable, good. That was the point. Because history should unsettle us. It should make us see how easily societies normalize cruelty, how quickly tradition can be twisted into exploitation, and how fragile our republics really are. So tell me what you think. Was Cato the Elder one of the most evil men in history, or just a product of his time? And if that made you feel uncomfortable, good. That was the point. And don't forget to subscribe and tell us what you think.